Hello, welcome to another informative episode on White Davy Gardening and Worm Farm. Today we are going to be discussing worm farming, and you are free to ask whatever questions you like. I'll do my best to answer them, and I'll be asking a few questions of my own. So, a lot of people are interested in worm farming. Hi, microfarmer, how are you? Hi, Chenille. Thanks for joining the live. So a lot of people are interesting. I can see that there are a few more people on here saying hi to all those whose name does not appear. Right, so a lot of people are interested in worm farming, and some already have a worm farm, but sometimes there can be difficulty with worm farms, or if you're new to it, then you might have a lot of questions. I help you. Yes, you made it, microfarmer. Oh, the snow up here. Well, let's see. We had snow yesterday, so I have some shoveling to do. Not looking forward to it, but what can be done? It's always like that. Anyway, getting ready to head out to the garden and listen to you. Oh, nice. I'm glad you could join me. Okay, just a minute. Yes, I'm still getting snow. We're going to be getting snow for the entire um, winter, actually. The snow doesn't stop. We have long period of time during the winter when we don't get any snow, and then we have periods when we just days and days of snow. So it's not anything we can control. Last year and the year before that, I guess we can't complain much because although we got snow, it wasn't a lot compared to what we got this year, because what we got this year, they said that snowstorm alone was more than all the snow we got last year. So I guess because we had it good the last couple of years, we can't complain too much this time around. Yes, I just have to get these devices on silent. I should have done that before the live started, but well, I was a bit busy with the kids, so I'm sorry about that. Okay, so if you have questions, feel free to ask, and I'll be asking some. And my first OMG, wow, props to you for surviving such an enormous change in climate from Jamaica to Canada. Yeah, I think we went a bit crazy when we came here. We had no idea what we were getting into. You can't know until you experience it, then you know what you're getting into. By then, it's too late to go back. So, yeah. So, some of the questions that people ask, may I ask what drove you to move? Um, that wasn't my desire, but my husband wanted a change of scene, and of course, wherever he goes, I'm going to be there. So I tag along, and here we are. Yeah, but we had options of going to different countries, but I guess this one worked out to be the one we choose in the end. So here we are. So the first question that is on my list today is, how much casting can a pound of worm produce in a month? And this question is important if you are concerned about having sufficient casting for your garden, or for whatever purpose you plan to use your casting. I shouldn't. For whatever purpose you want to use a casting. So having a good idea of how much casting a pound of worm can produce.
You're green.
My background is green. Maybe it's your phone because mine is not green on the screen.
Yeah, it is.
Oh well, nothing I can do about that. Right. So please behave yourself, child.
I'm just gonna touch it.
Okay. Bye. Yeah. So knowing how much castings you're gonna need depending on your surface area that you want to cover with castings. So it is good to know how much pound of worm you can get. Of course, the amount of casting that you get is dependent on a lot of things. So there isn't any hard and fast rule. So it depends on how much you're gonna feed your worm in a month. It depends on the condition in the bin, like your temperature, your moisture content, your the acidity, things like that is going to determine how much casting your worm produce in a month. And the reason for that is when the condition in the bin is good, worms eat more. When the condition in the bin is bad, they eat less. But in general, the average amount of casting that a pound of worm can produce in a month is 3.5 pounds. Of course, the moisture level in the casting also determines the weight of the castings, which is why I don't sell my casting by weight, because the moisture content might make it seem to be more than it actually is if there's a lot of moisture in it. Right, so 3.5 pound is usually the average amount of castings that worms produce, 1 pound of worm produce in a month. Now, do worms attract rats and mice? Well, that answer is not a definite yes nor a definite no. Rats, yes, they do. Worm farm do attract rats and mice, and that is because of what they are fed, food scraps and stuff like that. Rats always tend to gravitate to this type of food, and so you can control the rats in your bin. However, I'm going to be telling you later on how you can do that. So if you feed them food scraps, it's going to attract rats and mice. But if you feed them things like castings or stuff that you know the rats don't eat, but the worms will eat, then then it won't be too bad. Let's see now. LP says, how about how much castings do you add to your garden? I have no specific amount that I add to my garden. It depends on how many plants I have and the type of plants that I have. So if I know that my plant is a heavy feeder, or if it is a larger plant and food producing, then I give it more castings. And if it is a smaller plant, then it gets less. When I'm about to plant, I like to put 1 cup of casting in each hole for the plants. And then depending on the size of the plant and what it produces, then I might tap it up a month later and stuff like that. So the good thing about casting is that unlike a lot of fertilizers, worm casting slowly releases nutrients. So it doesn't just dump all the nutrients all at once. And because it's slowly released, you don't have to worry about all the nutrients being gone within a short period of time. So you know that your plant always have nutrients there to feed on. And then moisture doesn't wash away the nutrients. So that is another benefit of using the casting in your in your garden. Did I answer your question, LP? Are you satisfied with that answer? Okay, now, do rats eat worm? This is a very interesting question. Okay, you're welcome. Yes, rats do eat worms. Mice, however, not necessarily. But if you have mice, what got you started in worm farming? Interesting question, micro farmer. Uh, Composting. I was composting in well, 3 years ago, and I wanted to have a more efficient composting bin. I, in the backyard gardener, thank you for joining the live. So I'm just answering micro farmers' question has what got me started in worm farming. So 3 years ago, I was doing research to see how I can make my compost more efficient, and so I did some research, and during the process of doing my research, I came across worm farming, which I've never heard about prior to that day. And it seemed pretty interesting. So I started watching a lot of videos and doing a lot of research. And I like what I saw. So I started searching around in my community online to see if I can find compost worms. Unfortunately, there was one lady in the city who sell compost worms. I found a few others. Um, I found one pet store that sell them, but the price was not efficient at all for what I wanted because they just sell a small amount, like a dozen worm for X amount of money, because they're selling it for pet food. And then I saw somewhere out of the city, but their price didn't work either for the amount of worm that you were getting. So the lady beside near me, her her prices were good, and so I bought a pond from her. She actually delivered it specifically to my home and put it in the compost bin that I had, a nice 4x4x4 bin. So she put it in the bin for me, and she put a few of them in the garden. And man, was I ever surprised, because she told me that within 3.5 months, my worm population would double. So I was all excited here, waiting to see that increase. But then I was very surprised, because that was the 26th of June when she came and delivered the worms. And 2.5 months later, it started to get cold, and so I harvested the worms and bring them indoors. I did not get to twice the amount, but instead I had 20 times the amount of worms that I bought. So I was very surprised because I wasn't expecting that. So I started doing a lot more research on worms and find that your worms, you can have up to 28 times the amount of worms within a month. Sorry, not within a month. Have I been saying within a month? Because if I'm saying that, then it is incorrect. It should be within 3 months. So they say your population can double within 3 months, but within 2.5 months, I had 20 times. Hi, Her Healthy Home. How are you this morning? Right, so that is how I got my start in worm farming. And I don't regret it because I've seen a lot of benefits since then. Okay, so we were discussing whether or not rats and I'm great, thank you. Okay, good. Yeah, so we were discussing whether or not rats and mice eat worms, and yes, rats do. Mice, however, will eat your worm not intentionally. Maybe if they're hungry, they would, if they don't have anything else to eat. But in general, mice don't just go and look for worms to eat, but they will come to your worm bin to eat the food scraps that is there. Hi, Han White. I'm glad you were able to finish your teaching before so you can join me. Right, so mice, they will go after the food scraps, but because the worms always gravitate to the food scraps and they stay there, what you will find, let's see, I'm sorry I can't join you today because I am still teaching. Okay, no worries, sis, no worries. Enjoy your teaching as you always do. Um, Hi, Russell. Okay, thank you. Good story on worms. Introduction. Yes. Okay, so the mice, however, will go for the food scraps. And as they go for the food scraps, you know your worms are going to be on the food scraps. The mice are not going to ask the worms, "Oh, worms, can you move over so I can eat your food scraps?" No, they're not going to do that. So they're just going to go in and start eating the food scraps. Because the worms are on it, the worms will either get killed or get eaten as well. So in that case, yes, they decimate your worms even though they are not there to eat the worms. Okay, so next question. How can you prevent mice and rats from going in your worm bin? Now I had people ask me this question before, and there are just a few things that you can do, and it depends on the type of worm bin that you have. So if you're using a compost bin like mine, like because I keep worms in the summer in my compost outside, that is just 4 by 4 by 4 pallets. It's not designed where the boards on the pallets are close enough where the rats and mice well, I don't have rats here, but mice can't get in. If you're building with board, then you want to make sure that the space that you have is no more than 1/4 inch. That will keep them out, but it also have to have a cover, and the ground, the bottom layer of your bin, has to be something that the mice and the rats cannot get in through as well. So it is a bit tricky if you're going to be using uh, compost. Yeah. So for my 4 by 4, I started out with just the 4 by 4 on the soil because I wasn't concerned about mice or rats. Now, in recent times, I've concreted the bottom of mine, but that is a bit of an expensive adventure if you don't want to go that route. If you're using worm bins like totes and stuff like that, having a cover is a good way to keep the rats and mice out. And again, the holes in your bin must be no more than 1/4 inch because rats and mice can shrink themselves down very small in order to get into tiny spaces. The next thing that you can do to, okay, bye, Han White. How long have I been in Canada? Sorry, I forgot to answer that question. I've been here 10 years. Right. So, the next thing that you can do is bury your food scraps down in the bottom of your bin, and then make sure that you have a good amount of cover on it, because then that will keep down the smell of the food scraps and less likely to attract the rodents. Of course, I don't know, their nose are so good. They can smell the food scraps from so far away, and then, excuse me, they will just find your bin and go in and decimate. So bury it as deep as you can into the material that is in your bin, and that will help to control them. Sorry you had to ask that question twice, or a healthy home. Okay, now the fifth question. How many worms do you need to start a worm bin? That is a very popular question, and that depends on what you're going to do, what your final outcome with your worms are. Are you starting it for commercial purposes? Are you starting it for domestic purposes? Do you have a large garden? Do you have a small garden? Are you planning to expand your garden in the near future? These factors are going to determine how much worms you start with. But if you're new to worm farming, it is recommended that you start with a pound of worms. Some people start with less, like uh, half pound, which is for your red wrigglers. Half pound of worms is about 500 mature red wigglers. So about 1,000 mature red wigglers make a pound. So you want to start with half pound or a pound. Most people start with a pound. And the reason you don't want to start with a bulk if you're inexperienced is that if you make any serious mistake, you could end up losing your worms, and you don't want to lose a large quantity of worm because these worms are not cheap. So you have to consider these factors. And I would recommend doing a lot of research if you're going to be starting your worm farm for the first time so that you can minimize the amount of mistakes that you make. And it's also, sorry, I'm listening but not at the chat. No worries, my dear. Um, so, yes, so when you start off with your worms, you want to make sure that you do research. And if you know people who are into worm farming, you want to talk to them again too, get their experience, learn about the mistakes that they've made and the consequences of those mistakes, stuff like that. Because when you do that, then you're putting yourself in a better position to have a successful worm bin right off the bat. If you're starting, I agree, start with a pound, says LP. I started with 250, and while they have certainly grown in population, the smaller amount don't eat as much food as I think most people would want. Yes, it is true. Starting with a pound is ideal for more than one reason because, like LP says, they don't eat a lot sometimes, and because of that, you're not going to be getting the amount of casting that you want within a certain period of time. And not only that, the amount of food scraps that the average household produces in a month, if you start with smaller than a pound of worms, they might not be able to keep up with that food scraps because, as you may know, a pound of worm can eat anything from zero to their full body weight in a day. So I've never seen them eating a full body weight in a day, but from my research, I've heard that it has happened. Most of the time, they say they can eat up to half their body weight. If what I saw the first time I started my worm bin, the rate that they reproduce and multiply, then uh, on that note, I would say yes, they did eat their body weight in a day because everything that I had in that compost bin, and the bin was almost full, everything in that bin was composted within 2.5 months. So, based on that, I would say yes, they can eat their body weight in a day, but it is very rare that they do that because the possibility of getting the condition in your worm bin to be ideal, to be perfect, is very, very low. So, because of that, they will not eat at the maximum that they can eat within a certain time span. So, starting with a pound is ideal. Now, yes, so back to the question of how much can you should start with. I appreciate that you said a range from zero to body weight. A lot of people just emphasize that they can eat their body weight when, like you're saying, it depends on condition. Hi, Princess Lillian. How are you? Thank you for joining us. Right, so my experience, there are times when I feed my worms and I'm watching to see the result, and within a day, and I can't see a difference. And there are times when you feed them and you can see a difference pretty quickly. So so many things can happen. You might be following all the rules where you're maintaining the moisture content, you have temperature control, you have sufficient food in the worm bin, you're not overfeeding them, and the bin is not acidic. But worms are sensitive. They're sensitive to vibration, they're sensitive to barometric pressures, they're sensitive to so many things around them. So even if you're doing your very best, that doesn't mean that everything is going to be ideal for the worms. So it's going to affect how they eat, how fast or how slow they eat, and that will in effect affect the casting production. So starting with a pound of worm is ideal. If you're going to be raising worm for commercial purposes, though, are you planning to sell to large? organization? Are you going to be selling to retailers? Are you going to be selling to farms? Are you going to be selling to backyard gardeners? These factors also are going to determine how much worms you start off with. So you have to make that decision and then by source your worms accordingly. Now, what if you want to start a worm bin and you're wondering where can you get compost worms to buy? Well, you can look around or ask around in your community or surroundings, or you can go online and source your worms there. Sometimes, depending on the type of compost worm that you want, you might have them growing, they might be native to your environment as well. So, some places like where my sister Anna White lives, her worms or European nightcrawler, she did not start a worm bin, she started a compost bin. But because her bin had a hole in it, these European night crawlers came out of the soil and into her bin, and so she ended up with a compost bin. So sometimes your composting worms can be native to your environment. Now, there are four main type of worms that are ideal for composting, and that's the red wiggler, which is my favorite, the European night crawlers, the Canadian night crawlers, African night crawlers, and the blue worm. Now, the blue worm I am not very familiar with. I don't think I ever got a response to the email I sent you regarding shipping red wigglers to US. Yes, you haven't. I still haven't seen. Did you send me that email with the postal code? Because the last time you responded to me, you said you were gonna send the postal code, but I haven't seen that yet. Because the truth is, each time I have to ship, I have to find out specifically how much it's gonna cost because it depends on how much. I have a system I run. Okay, let me get back to that. Right, so as I was saying, Indiana, shipping depend on where you are in the US. So it's not one price that covers all regions of the US, as you may know. So because of that, I have to find out how much they're gonna charge to ship it to your specific location. So I can't just right off the bat say, okay, it's gonna cost X or Y, because then I won't be able to give you an accurate response as to how much the shipping is gonna cost. And I don't want to overcharge anyone. Usually, if I'm shipping, then what I do, I charge you the cost of the worms and exactly what the shipping company charged me for shipping. I don't add anything else to the shipping cost. So I like to find out and be specific about that. Russell says, I have a system I run once a year for 8 to 10 weeks. It starts out with 7 breeders in small shoebox type totes, and each box produces half pound in 6 months. Nice. I like your system. Sound as if you have it well organized, well figured out. Half pound with 7 breeders. So when you say 7 breeders, you mean 7 worms? Yes, you sent that. Okay, okay. I apologize for that, Indiana. I will have to go back and look at it. Okay. 7 mature worms. Wow, and you get half pound in 6 months. That's pretty good. And you say you run it for 8, 10 weeks. Nice, nice. Okay, now, right, I was talking about where you can source your compost worms. They can be sourced online or from a local producer, and sometimes it's native to your environment. I ordered a mix of worms, and they wound up being mostly blue. or the others died and the blue survived. I really like blue worms, but they're really skinny and small. I have reds popping up now. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry that the rest of them died. But at least it's good you started your worm bin healthy. Because you say you have now, and your worms died, you were seeing just the blue ones. So the worms would have laid their eggs, the reds would have laid their eggs before they die, because that is something that worms do. Whenever they realize that their lives are in danger, they would lay as many eggs as they can so that they can preserve their population. I'm going to separate the reds out into their own bin. The Euros don't seem to like me as much. Hush. I also find some dead ones. I'm just guessing they died or he sent me mostly blue. Okay. So when you bought the worms, you bought all of them combined in one package? Like they were all together in one? Russell says, I'll put 7 in one box every week for 8. Okay. Interesting. I'd like to try that too. 7 in a box every week. So, yes, I know he sells compost mixed. I've been on his site when I wanted worms, but found a cheaper, easier option close by. Let's see. So, Russell, when you put 7 in a box every 8 weeks, every 8 to 10 weeks, do you put 7 in the box this week and then in that same box or in a different box do you put another 7? It's a very intriguing way of doing it. Now you have me quite curious. The listing says you get a combination of blue, reds, and euros. I didn't know what what when I ordered them. Now I know. Okay. So okay. So LP, say it comes in a mix. Does that mean that you cannot order just red regulars or you cannot order just the euros? You have to buy it in a mix at all times? You're very curious too in Indiana. Yeah, it is curious because I've never really seen anyone doing it like that. I've seen where they just start the worm bin and then keep on feeding the worm bin as the bin grows. Then they would start another worm bin from that. But I've never seen anything this specific where you start and you have 7 per containers and every week you had 7 to another. That's interesting. I don't know if you can get just reds, but you can order euros. Oh, okay, okay. I ordered 100 euros separately. Okay, you'll have to do a new experiment with the 7. You know how I love to experiment with the worms, so I'll definitely be thinking about that one. See how that work out. Yeah. Okay, so can there be too much worms in your worm bin? Definitely. Worms, red wigglers, don't mind being in a group together. They seem to love that, but that only happens if mostly if they are fed food scraps. My bins are fed finished compost, so I don't get to see them in bundles, unfortunately. So it's hard for me to know how much worms are actually in my bin. I know how much I put in the bin initially, but to say okay, this bin has X amount in there now. It is very difficult for me to tell because it is finished compost and the entire bin is finished compost. Occasionally, I might have shredded paper in there, so the worms are just scattered all over the bin. When you have food scraps in there, though, they love the food scraps because of the microbes that grow on it, so they will just gravitate to the food scraps. So you get to see them that way. Now, space. Okay. Right. So the space matters for your worms. The red wrigglers like to bundle together. So on that note, you might be able to break the rule a little bit with the amount of red wigglers that you have in your compost bin. But the rule of the thumb is for your composting worms, irrespective of what species of worm it is, you want to have 1 square foot of surface area per pound of worms. There are some people who will go 2 pounds of worm per square foot, but you have to be very careful. You have to constantly be watching that bin to make sure that the worms are not trying to escape and things like that, because once the bin get crowded, the mature worms are going to come out of the bin so that the younger ones can survive. But that's not the only thing they do. Once your bin becomes too full, and when I say full, I'm not talking about the quantity of material in your bin, I'm talking about the amount of worms in your bin per surface area of the bin. So once that rule gets broken and the worms find that they don't have sufficient space, not only will they leave the bin and die, but the ones that remain in the bin, they're going to reduce production. So they're going to stop laying as much eggs as when they have a lot of space. They're going to slow down. So you don't want that, because the whole purpose of having your worm bin in the first place is, one, to control your food scraps, and two, for the casting that it produces. Bye. See you. I'm glad you were able to join us, Indiana. Right. So, because your goal is to recycle your food scraps and also to benefit from the castings, so you don't want to have a situation where, because of your action, your worms are slowing down production. So you have to make sure that when your bin gets overpopulated, you either start a new worm bin. I know that a lot of people who compost inside may say they don't have space for a lot of bins. So in that case, if you have friends or neighbors who would be interested in worms to start their own worm bin, you can give it to them, or the extra worms, you can always put it in your garden. And then the worms will stay there. If you have frigid winters like mine, then your worms will die out there, but before they die, they will lay a lot of eggs to preserve the species, and the eggs can survive the winter. So that is an option for you. How much will my worms eat? We kind of touched on this before, saying that they will eat anything from 0 to their full body weight in a day, but it depends on the condition in their bin. So if the bin has enough moisture, it has enough space, it has enough food, it has the right temperature, the bin is not acidic. Hi, best yet journey. Thank you for joining us. Right. So if these conditions are met, or most of these conditions are met, then the worms will eat more. If these conditions are not ideal, your worms will eat less. Okay, now this is a question that I get asked sometimes. If I would like to use castings but I don't want to raise worms, are castings available? Because I know, can you tell us about your outside garden worm? Okay, my outside garden worms. As I mentioned before in this live, when I bought my worms, the lady put a handful of worms in my garden. Uh, they have been doing well, but the population does not uh, increase as it does in a worm bin. When winter comes, most of them freeze. Red wigglers are surface feeders, and so they stay on the surface. That doesn't mean that if you have a worm bin, they won't be throughout your worm bin. But what it means is that they won't bury deep down. They won't go deep down in order to find the food source. They're always trying to find it on the surface. So if you have your worms in the garden, then they're going to be eating what is on the top 2, 3, 4 inches of surface. If the material on the surface, however, is all organic, even if it is 6, 8 inches, they're going to stay all over in that portion of the material, because red wigglers live wherever the food is, whereas the other composting worms will live in the soil and come up and feed on the food scraps and then go back into the soil. But red wigglers will stay wherever the food is. So in my garden, those red wigglers that she put in there, for the first year I took out as many as I could, and the way that I took them out is to turn down. I put some in grow bag, not knowing they would die in winter. Your project makes me want to extract them before winter in future. Okay. Right, so just turn down container, just put food scraps underneath it, something maybe melon and stuff like that because they love that. Put that on the surface of your garden. Turn down a container that is dark over it. As the time gets cold, the worms will go up underneath that container and eat the food scraps that is there, and then you can harvest the worms from there. So yeah, so you asked about the worms in my garden. So I harvested what I could, but they were scattered all over my garden. So harvesting all of them was not very possible. So the funny thing is, they say that the worms would die, but I had worms the following year in my garden that I could tell they are red wigglers, but only a very small amount. I've noticed, however, that last year fall I put several heaps of composting material of food scraps in my garden that I was collecting from a restaurant, and it covered practically all of my garden. That is the not my raised bed, just the one in ground. So I covered it. I used the food scraps and created a lot of heaps because all of my compost bins were full. I've noticed that I have quite a few red wigglers since I did that. So it means then that these worms, they will freeze, but if you have enough layers where it can keep the heat, then a few of them might survive. The thing is, when the spring came and I was removing all of that compost to the worm bin, I find red wigglers alive that were not hatchlings, not juveniles, but mature worms. To be able to find mature worms at the start of spring would indicate that they would have to have survived winter. But they only did that because the heat that I had was very high, very high. It was almost 4 to 5 feet high. So because it is food scraps, it has all that nitrogen, so it kind of produced some summer heat. And then with the snow over it, the snow provide a blanket that caused an insulation. So some of them did survive, but not all, because you do see dead ones there. Yes, but the good thing is that even if they all die, the eggs will survive. So I do have a few of them in my garden. Okay, so we were discussing if you would like to use casting, but it is great LP. If you would like to have casting but you don't want to raise worms, is castings available? That depends on where you are. and how familiar the people in your environment are of worm casting. So some greenhouses may carry worm castings. It's not very popular, and sometimes there are greenhouses that might carry this in bulk as well. But castings, you're more likely to find it online than it is to find in a store near you. Now here's a question to you for you. Do you have access to worm casting in your region? Have you ever seen worm castings in stores near you? Prior to starting my worm farm, I didn't know anything about worm castings. You have it near you. Okay, that's good, LP. I didn't know anything about worm casting or anything of the sort. So when I started my worm farm, however, I went into a store and I was surprised to see that they have castings. But the sad thing is that they only sell in a little quarts, just like a quart of castings, that is it. So yeah, it's not very popular here. The only place I know here that you can actually go and get casting is from the lady that I bought my worms from or from me. But there is no one else around here, as far as I know, that are stores that carry worm castings. I would have to keep on looking to see because that's been 3 years. That may have changed by now. I bought a prawn from Lowe's before I knew anything. It was dried and sealed in a bag. Now I think that's probably a cheat because I hear that you need moisture and ventilation to keep microbes alive. Um, yes, it is. It's a good idea to have your compost being moist and ventilated for the microbes, as you rightly say. I I've never had any experience with dealing with a very dry castings, but the microbes reproduce if they have the moisture and the air. So buying it really dry is definitely something I wouldn't go for. Um, I'm gonna have to allow some of my castings to go dry and take it to the university to get it tested to see if there's any benefit to it when it is in that state, because it is something that I really want to know. It was a fine dry powder. Worm castings usually come in little, almost like a pebble. So for it to be powdery, I'd wonder if I see that, I would be wondering how old that casting is, because castings can last up to 3 years. I've never had any for I've always used up mine. Um, that's a good idea I got from you there, Helpy. Now I'm going to select a portion of my casting and keep it for 3 years. I need to see if it goes, if it turns powder. I just have to jot that down so that my memory don't fail me. Right. Yeah, I'd be very skeptical of that one. But then if you don't know, do you? But then I am not proficient enough to say that it doesn't have any benefits to it, because I've only been doing this for 3 years. Um, so I'm gonna have to get some of that. Oh yes, let me jot that down as well to get that thing tested to see if it has any benefits after it has dried out. I think it's how they manufactured it, mostly like like they dried it. It wasn't exactly like powder, but more powder than what I see fresh and moist. Well, it is natural for it to become finer in size because of the moisture, because you know that when you put moisture to it, it's going to just wick it and swell up. But as it dry up, then the smaller it is going to get. It is interesting though. I really would like to know the answer to those two questions. Okay, what is the best time to start a worm farm for those who would like to have a worm farm? Well, worm farm can be started at any point in time, but there is one particular time of year that I would recommend you start your worm farm. I'm not saying that you're to sit and wait for this time to come. No, before you start your worm farm. I'm not saying that at all because that would be a total waste of time. But spring, December, between December and the spring, is the best time to start your worm farm. And the reason I say that, did I say December to spring? What am I doing? Not December to spring. Fall to spring is the best time to start your worm farm. And the reason you want to start then is that most people start with just a pound of worms. You want to maximize the amount of castings that you have for your garden, and usually 6 months is what it takes for you to be able to do your first harvest, to harvest any sufficient amount of castings that you can use in the garden. So if you start like in the early fall to spring and you allow time to pass, then you're going to have a reasonable amount of casting that you can use in your garden. So that is why I say this time is the best time to start your worm farm. Of course, you can start it anytime you want. The truth is, there is no time like the present. Sooner you start, the sooner you're going to be harvesting castings, the more castings you're going to have when you need it. So, no time like the present. And like I said, it is fall. Well, officially it is fall, but as far as I'm concerned, as long as it is cold, it is winter. So, now is a good time to start your worm farm. So if that is your desire and you don't have a worm farm yet, by all means, go ahead and start your worm farm. If you want the benefit of the casting, however, and you don't want the hassle of dealing with the worms, then you can always buy the castings or put your food scraps in your garden. It will attract worms, and the worms will feed on the food scraps and produce castings for you. Of course, there are those who don't like to see worms, so they won't use that method as well, in which case, the only option you have is to buy your castings. Now, thanks, LP. Now, how long do worms take to settle in their new home? Well, worms can take up to 3 weeks to settle down because they have to go through transportation, especially if they're traveling from far. They are in a totally new environment. And so you will see when you get your worms that in most cases, after you transfer them to your worm bin, they're always crawling out, trying to escape. And it's because they're not used to that environment yet. So it takes up to 3 weeks. It can take less, but it takes up to 3 weeks for them to settle down. So if after 3 weeks have passed and you still see your worms trying to escape, then you need to pay close attention to what's happening, because maybe something is not right in the environment where they are. And so you might need to take action. Now, what can you do if your worms are trying to escape from the bin? Have you ever had that situation where your worms are trying to escape? What have you done to prevent this from happening? And what was the reason that they were trying to escape? Well, I can't answer about when I first started my worm bin, because it was a compost bin outside. They didn't try to to escape because they had sufficient amount of food. But when I harvested them and bring them indoors, they did try to escape. I put a layer of dry shredded material on top. Oh, okay, that works too. Yeah, so my worms, when I first harvested them and brought them indoors, they try to escape, and I would just keep going back and put them in. But when the worms are trying to escape, light is a very good method of keeping them in. So you get a bright light. Worms don't like light because light dries out their skin, and they need their skin to be moist in order to be able to breathe because they breathe through their skin. Hi, Cajun. Glad you could join us. You said you're stopping by for a few. If the internet will let me watch the stream. Okay. Well, I'm glad you could join me. I hope your internet works well. It can be so problematic with these internet these days, and more so since more and more people are turning to the internet with what's going on. But I'm glad you could join me. So yeah, so if you have a worm bin and the worms are trying to escape, use a light, bright light. Hi, Guten. How are you? I'm glad you were able to join us. Just stopping by for a few. No worries. So put a light, a bright light over the bin, or put them out in the sunlight if you're able to do so, if the temperature allows you to. Make sure the cover is not on the bin. The light will cause the worms to move down because they want to go away from the light. So they'll keep moving down, and then that will control your worms escaping to an extent. But you have to be careful. If you're putting the light over them, please make sure that it is not hot light that is going to be drying out the material that they're in or drying them out, because then you will lose your worms. It's better to have a few crawl out than to have all your worms drying out. So you have to keep an eye on them when you're using the light method to keep the worms down in the bin. Uh, so when you start your new worm bin, if your worms are trying to escape, this light method works very well. Don't keep it on them for more than 3 days. After 3 days of having the light on them, they will get used to the idea that, okay, I can't go up there because the light is there, and they will stay in your bin. If they keep crawling out after that, then keep monitoring that bin because it means that the condition in your bin might not be too good. I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. Thank you, Guten. Now, there are other reasons apart from a new worm bin why your worm tried to escape. The bin might be acidic, in which case you could use diatomaceous earth, eggshells, or lime, which is calcium carbonate powder, and that will help to reduce the acidity in the bin. Our worms were also trying to escape. They always try to escape if it is a new bin or if the condition in the bin is not right. Now, moisture. You have to have this right amount of moisture in your bin. Some people allow their bin to be a bit on the drier side. Some people allow it to be on the moister side. Um, I like to keep my bin moist, like fairly moist, because if it is on the drier side, then the worms are not going to feel too happy moving around freely. They're not going to be reproducing at the rate that you want them to reproduce. So if you're concerned about controlling the rate of which they reproduce, then you can keep your bin on the drier side. Not too dry though, because they need that moisture to breathe, because they breathe through the skin. If you want it to be on the moist, if you don't want to control the population, you just want them to reproduce as much, then keep it on the moisture side because they're going to be happier, which means they're going to heat more. And when the bin has enough moisture, your worms tend to look fat and nice. When it is on the drier side, your worms tend to look skinny. So, how can you know if it is too much moisture in there? Just take a handful of the material, give it a squeeze, and you just want to see a few drops between your fingers. You don't want to see water running. If water is running, it is way too moist. So, you want to make sure though that you have the right amount of moisture in your bin. The temperature in your bin too, between 10 and 21 degrees Fahrenheit. Sorry, 10 and 21 degrees Celsius, which is around 50 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, is what the worms like. That is the condition where they reproduce the best. If, however, your temperature is above that, then they will still reproduce, but if it is too hot, they're going to slow down, they're going to escape from your bin, and they may die. So you have to find method of keeping them cool. If it goes beyond 10, they're going to go into hibernation, and then your production is going to go down. So you need to try to find a balance for that. Now, if your worm bin is outside, you don't have a heated space for your worms, but your worms are not going to die if they're outdoors, but they are too cold, so they're going to slow down. You can always put a thick blanket on their bin to help to keep them a bit warmer. That will help. Or if you have heated space, then you can put them where you have the heated space. Now, in your area, do you get casting in small package or large one? Are you able to get in bulk? African night crawlers and blue worms are considered tropical, but also not for beginners. Yeah, well, those two I have no experience with, but yes, naturally they would be. I don't know about the blue worm, but the African nightcrawler would be tropical. I've never really seen a blue worm either. I've never seen the African nightcrawler either. They can tolerate and prefer warmer temperatures. Okay, that's pretty good. So if you're in the tropics, then that's the worms. Those are the worms to go with. That's nice to know. In case I ever decide to go back home, then I'll have to try to get my hands on those type of worms. I don't know about the ANC. The blue worms are great feeders and breeders. Okay, cool. Yeah, I would like to try with those worms though, but then I don't know if I don't have the space. My red wigglers are taking up practically all the space I have. Now I'm starting out with the ENCs. I don't know how what I'm going to do with them when they start reproducing a lot, because all of the space that I have so far is taken up by the red wigglers. So I will have to see how that goes. Um, but yeah, I would like to try all the nightcrawler varieties, and I would like to try the blue worms as well. So it is something I will look into the future, but at the moment I don't really have the space for them. I'm even struggling to find space to keep my Canadian nightcrawlers. And as you may see from some of my previous videos, my Canadian nightcrawlers are not doing so well. So we'll see. I have to master the ones I have first before I think about branching out into other varieties of worms. But it would be interesting. I would like to have all five of them together and experiment with them to see which one eat more, which one reproduce more, um, which one produces more casting in the same time. It would be nice to have all of them and just run that experiment. So now that I have, well, I can't say I have Canadian night crawlers because it's about three of them remaining in the bin, sadly. So, but now that I have those, I would like to do an experiment with the three Canadian Euros and the red wigglers that I have. Blues are blues too are considered travelers. Oh, that's good to know. I've heard they are pests in commercial settings because they travel to other bins. Interesting. Probably why Jim sells a mix. That's a possibility too. That would be a very informative video experiment. Yeah, it would be. It would be so much to learn from that. So you said they travel to other bins. They need moisture to breathe. At the moment, we only have red wigglers. Oh, okay. Oh, hi, garden lady. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, so interesting about the blue worm. If they travel to other commercial bin, how long can they last without moisture? Um, what type of commercial bins are these producers using? Are how close are the bins together? These are interesting questions because I mean you must have ways to control the worms so that they don't go from bin to bin. Worms don't like to travel far. They're not going to travel outside of their comfort zone for long unless something is wrong in their bin. So if I have blue worms and they're going to be traveling to other bins, then I would have to do an experiment with them to see um, how far would they travel away from their bin without moisture and food scraps around them. How far would they go? And based on how far they go, that is how far I would keep them from other bins. Um, what type of compost bin are these commercial entities using? Are they doing those, what do they call it now, rows in the ground where they raise the worms? Because if so, the blue worms can always just bury down in the ground and cross over to the other bin. So that would not be a very effective way of doing it if you know that your blue worms are going to be problematic. I've also learned that a lot of large farmers use a mix of composting worms. So depending on the season, the best species dominate. So the population fluctuate. Good question. Okay, thank you. That is an interesting point. That makes sense. But then, if you are that works very well if you are a casting producer. So you're not interested in selling worms unless you're going to sell a combination of worms together. Then, because if you're going to be selling red wrigglers by themselves or the night crawlers by themselves or the blue worm by themselves, then you wouldn't want to raise them together because you can have cross contamination when you try to harvest your worms. So, if you are a worm farmer whose focus is on castings, then that would work very well because then, as you say, the dominant one will rule when the temperature is ideal for them. That is a pretty good way of doing it in that case. Yeah, but I'd have to, I don't know. No, now I want to raise the, now I want to raise the blue worm so that I can experiment to see how you can control them because there must be ways, things that you can do to ensure that they don't um, go into other worm bins. Let's see. Blue worms, I'm told, are the ones most known for traveling when the pressure is up during storm. Okay, okay. And we can't control the storms, can we? So I guess we just have to put up with them traveling. I would have to find a way though. There must be a way to keep them out. Let's see. Change the gloves when working with them so eggs and babies do not transfer. Yes, that I agree with. That is something I definitely practice when I'm working with my worms. Well, as you know, the vast majority of times I don't really wear gloves when I'm working with my worms. But the tools that I use in my worms, whenever I'm switching from one type of worm bin to another, I usually wash it off because I don't want to cause a cross contamination. But that is a very good idea, garden lady. When I use lids, I always had a condensation on the sides, and my blue crawled crawled all the time. But without lids, No condensation, no crawlers. Interesting. So that would indicate then that they are extremely sensitive to any changes around them. So to raise them, then you would have to try your best to control changes. I guess they won't like noise, they won't like the vibration, they won't like the barometric pressures and stuff like that around them when that changes. So if when the cover is on, they don't crawl they crawl about, but temperature is when the lid is not on, they stay quiet. Then for those ones, you might want to keep the lid off, but then you might have to find some form of cover that does not increase condensation, but at the same time, you have a cover on them. So using a mesh, like your window screen or something of the sort, would at least keep your bin covered because you don't want all sort of things getting in your bin. For sure, garden lady, wisps are so tiny. Great point, White Lady. Okay, thank you, Helpy. White Davy, how big is your worm farm? It's not big. Well, compared to um a domestic worm farm, then it might be considered big, but looks can be deceiving because I have about 60 bins. They're not big bins because they're not totes like the regular, like is common for worm bins. It's those concrete mixing trays, the smaller ones. That's what I use. So those don't really hold a lot of worms, and it is only over this winter that I end up with that much. Prior to this winter, I only had about 20 bins, but because I put the worms in my compost bin outside, they reproduce a lot faster than when they are in that confined tote. So I was able to divide the bin up into 40 and get those 40 extra, but it's not that I have a lot of worms in them actually. I have maybe a handful of worms in each of those bins, but I like to make it so that my worms have a lot of space to move around because the more space they have to move around, the more they're going to reproduce. So I like to make them have a lot of space. And when I say space, I don't mean just the open bin. I try to put in as many material as I can into the bin so that they can move about freely, and wherever they go they have food. Because when worms realize that they have food, moisture, space, and the right temperature, they are going to reproduce faster. So having that many bins really is just my way of tricking them, so to speak, into producing more for me. So it's not that I have a lot of worms per se. Yeah, because the reason I spread them out in those bins so that I have so many bins, as I mentioned, is to make them reproduce. Because I'm following the same principle that when I started my worms in worm farm initially, and this year when I put them in my compost bin, they reproduce faster than when I have them in totes. So I'm trying to recreate that situation where small amount of worms, large space, because then it means larger or greater production for me. So it's not really that I have a lot. I'm just trying to trick those worms into becoming a lot. Okay. Yeah, blues. I'd love to see more blues. Just keep them warm. Oh, okay. Yes, okay, you say they're tropical. Yeah. No, I really want to get my hands on some of those blues and ANCs. Some of those experiment would go pretty well. Hi, May Olmsted. I'm glad you were able to join us. I'm almost at the end of the live, but just gonna be discussing some of the pointers made here. Let's see. Howdy from everyone in Texas, fellow vermies. Hi, howdy to all of you Texas wormies. I have blues in my garden. Oh, are your blues native to your garden, lady? Garden lady, or did you put them there? Um, Canada has restrictions on what worms you can bring in. I'm not sure what worms they have the restrictions on just yet, but there are some areas in Canada where they have restrictions on bringing in worms, composting worms, and they say the reason for that is years ago, many years ago, composting worms, and I'm not sure what species it was or species, were brought in and released, eventually released into the environment. There are some areas that did pretty well because of these worms, but then there are plants that do not like a lot of organic material. And so when these worms got released into that environment, they created a lot of organic material in the soil, and so a lot of the trees and plants in that region died because the conditions were not ideal for them. So Canada has restrictions on what you can do with in terms of bringing in worms. So I'm going to have that is something that I'm going to have to research because I just recently learned that, because I would really like to know what type of worms and stuff like that. So even if you're going to be bringing in those restrictive worms, if you can, you're not allowed to release them. So if you have to get rid of them, you either have to give them away to someone who wants them, or you're going to have to kill them. But yeah, you can't release them in the environment. But I really would like to know what type of worms those were. Let's see. Mine don't crawl anymore with the dry material on top plus paper cover over that. Okay, so as long as you're able to keep them dry and warm, then they are good to go. And dry is relative. It is the material on top that is dry. So, LP, your worms that your blue worms, do they like material to be deep? Do they like to bury themselves? Because I know they say night crawlers on a whole are not surface feeders. Unlike the red wigglers that are surface feeders and live in the food, they say the ANC like to live in the soil and then come out and feed. So do you have to keep a large amount of material in your bin, like your bedding? Do you have to have a lot of bedding for those worms? Oh, hi, Ann White. You finally finished your teaching, eh? Good. I'm glad you were able to join us. So, yeah, so I was asking you, LP, if you need to have a lot of bedding for those ENCs. Uh, Got to go back to work. Okay. Thank you for joining us, Garden Lady. I'm glad you were able to take part. Have a safe day at work. Okay. I cover the material, but not the bin. I need a mesh cover like you use. Okay. Yeah, they work. They work pretty well. It Even though they can make themselves, the worms can make themselves small enough to actually come out through the holes in the mesh. They tend not to crawl out much, but then I don't really have worms crawling out of my bin anyway. So yeah, but they tend not to crawl out much with the cover there, and then I get to keep out those nasty flies and stuff like that. But yeah, it's good that the paper does work to cover the bin and keep them in. So do you use like a lot of shredded paper on top, or you just use solid paper on top to keep those blues in? Russell says commercial farms size their worm. If blue worms get in the mix, they can mess up the growing process. Mm, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I don't know. It sounds as if the blue worm might be a bit of a trouble, but I would like to know how much trouble they are. But then initially I wouldn't keep them anywhere close to where I have my other worms. That way, even if they should escape the bins, then they would not be able to get into my other bins. I would keep them probably not even in the same room just to make sure until I can learn as much as possible about them. Yeah. There are many commercial farms. Some raise worms to sell the worms and then they will sell the castings too. Some focus specifically on worms, some focus on castings, some focus on both. So I guess if you're focusing on worms and you don't want to be selling a mixture of worms, then you have to find whatever method work in keeping them separate. Okay, take care, Guten. I'm glad you were able to join us. Uh, I do keep mine in about 6 inches or so. Okay. Sorry, I don't know if they are better in shallow or deep. Okay. Okay. But I do find the worms throughout the material, surface to bottom, probably 6 to 8 inches. Okay. Okay. Well, yeah, I know that when they say start, when they're starting ENCB, they like to say start with 6 inches or so of bedding. I really would like to grow the blue worms now. I'm intrigued. I want to see what they will do. Okay, the netting you gave me is great to keep the worms in my bin. Oh, oh, good, good. I'm glad it is working for you. Say, I use at least an inch or more of shredded paper and cardboard dry. Then I put a fold paper bag over that. I think my ENC don't like that material. I think my ENC don't like that method. I recently wet all the shredded stuff in their bin. Oh, okay. Okay. So do you keep your okay, yes, you said you have your ENC ordered separately so they wouldn't be in your blue bin. Okay. So different treatment for the blue worms from the ENC. That is interesting. See, that is why I like to experiment. There are so many things that you can learn from these guys because you'd figure worms are worms, right? But just like us humans and other animals, they have what they like and they don't like and they don't all like the same thing. Interesting. I wonder if I can create space for some ANC and blue worms. I'm going to have to look into that. I have to go and experiment with those guys. Okay. Let's see. LP says Marty's gardening.